This is Scary Folktales USA. Before we begin, a brief warning. The following story contains atmospheric horror, supernatural elements, and descriptions of isolation that may be unsettling for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The air in the Florida Everglades doesn't just sit, it breathes. It is a heavy, wet blanket that smells of sulfur, crushed hibiscus, and the ancient, rotting secrets of the swamp. To most, the backroads of the Sunshine State are merely a means to get to the neon lights of Orlando or the salt-sprayed boardwalks of Miami. But for Caleb and his younger sister, June, the asphalt ribbon stretching through the heart of the Ocala National Forest was a path into the unknown. They weren't looking for beaches. They were looking for a ghost. A town called Cypress Key that shouldn't exist. A place whispered about in gas stations and diner booths, said to disappear entirely when the clock struck 12. Caleb gripped the steering wheel of his weathered SUV, his knuckles white against the dark leather. He was a man driven by the digital age's greatest hunger, the need to see what no one else had seen. His camera sat on the dashboard, its red standby light blinking like a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. Beside him, June stared out the window, her eyes tracking the endless silhouettes of cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The moss hung like gray, tattered funeral shrouds, swaying in a breeze they couldn't feel inside the car. She wasn't an explorer by heart. She was there because she loved her brother, and because she felt a cold, prickling sensation in her marrow that told her he shouldn't be out here alone. "The map says there's nothing for another 40 miles, June murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the tires. No towns, no outposts, just water and gators. Caleb, maybe the legend is just that, a legend. A story told by locals to keep tourists from wandering onto private property." Caleb shook his head, a determined glint in his eyes. "The stories are too consistent, June. The vanishing town of Cypress Key. My research found 3 different accounts from the 1970s of people who claim they drove into a thriving community at 1 a.m., only to wake up the next morning in a muddy clearing. This isn't just property. This is a ripple in the map. Imagine the footage. Imagine the truth behind the real stories everyone claims to have." They pulled into a dilapidated gas station that looked like it was being slowly swallowed by the surrounding ferns. A single, flickering fluorescent light illuminated a rusted pump. An old man sat on a rocking chair on the porch, his face a map of deep lines and sun-damaged skin. He wore an old trucker hat and held a whittling knife, carving a piece of dark wood into the shape of a crane. As Caleb stepped out of the car, the humid air hit him like a physical blow, tasting of stagnant water and old memories. "Doing a lot of driving for a Tuesday night," the old man said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He didn't look up from his carving. "Just passing through," Caleb replied, trying to sound casual as he unscrewed the gas cap. "Actually, we were looking for a place called Cypress Key. Ever heard of it?" The whittling stopped. The old man looked up, his eyes a pale, milky blue that seemed to reflect the moonlight. He stared at Caleb for a long beat, the silence between them filled only by the rhythmic scree-scree of the cicadas in the trees. The sound was deafening, a wall of noise that seemed to warn of an approaching storm. "Cypress Key ain't a place you find," the old man said slowly. "It's a place that finds you, and usually it only finds folks who are looking for something they don't have the right to own. My advice? Turn that rig around. Head back to the interstate. The Florida swamp has a way of keeping what it catches, and it's been hungry for a long time." June stepped out of the car, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Is it dangerous?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The old man smiled, revealing a few missing teeth. It wasn't a mean smile, but one of profound pity. Danger is a word for things you can see coming. Cypress Key is more of a consequence. It's a town built on the things people refuse to leave behind. If you see the white shell road, you keep driving. Don't stop for the lights. Don't stop for the music. And for the love of all that's holy, don't take anything that doesn't belong to you. Caleb thanked him, though his mind was already dismissing the man's words as the ramblings of a lonely local. He finished fueling, paid in cash, and climbed back into the driver's seat. As they pulled away, June looked back in the rearview mirror. The old man was gone, and the gas station light had flickered out, leaving only the oppressive darkness of the pines. They drove for another hour, the silence in the car growing heavy. The digital clock on the dashboard clicked toward 11:45 p.m. The road began to narrow, the asphalt turning into cracked concrete, and then, suddenly, the GPS signal died. The blue line on the screen vanished, replaced by a void. A thick, pearly mist began to roll off the swamp, curling around the tires like ghostly fingers. "Caleb, look," June whispered, pointing ahead. The headlights caught a change in the terrain. The dark, muddy path was being replaced by a road made of brilliant, crushed white seashells. It gleamed with an ethereal luminescence, reflecting the moonlight in a way that felt impossible. The air outside changed. The smell of the swamp vanished, replaced by the sweet, overwhelming scent of orange blossoms in full bloom, a scent that shouldn't be this strong in the middle of the night. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the entry point. He reached for his camera, his fingers trembling with excitement. "We're here, June. We're actually here." As they crossed onto the white shell road, the car's engine seemed to quiet, the sound muffled as if they were driving through cotton. The trees on either side were no longer gnarled and dying. They were lush, vibrant, and laden with fruit that looked like globes of gold under the moon. Far off in the distance, a clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3. The sound was deep and resonant, echoing through the mist. With every strike, a new light appeared in the distance. The warm glow of street lamps, the flicker of a neon sign, the steady light of a kitchen window. A town was materializing out of the Florida fog, a town that felt more real than the road they had left behind. But as the final chime of midnight rang out, the road behind them simply ended. There was no forest, no gas station, no way back. There was only the town of Cypress Key, waiting for its newest visitors. "We should have listened to the old man," June whispered, her hand finding Caleb's arm. Caleb didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the town square, where people in Sunday best were walking dogs and laughing under the midnight sun of a place that didn't exist. He had found his story, but as the mist settled, he realized the gate had closed behind them. The transition was not a jump or a jolt. It was a sliding of realities, like one transparency being laid over another. As Caleb steered the SUV onto the crushed shell road, the heavy, humid silence of the Everglades was replaced by a vibrant, humming stillness. The thick, sulphurous air of the swamp vanished, replaced by a breeze that carried the scent of gardenias and freshly mown grass. It was a scent so sweet it was almost sickly, a perfume that belonged to a midsummer afternoon in the 1950s, not a midnight in the middle of a Florida wilderness. Caleb slowed the car to a crawl. The headlights, which had been struggling against the oppressive forest darkness, now illuminated a scene of impossible perfection. On either side of the white road, manicured lawns began to appear. They were emerald green, trimmed with a precision that felt surgical. There were no weeds, no fallen cypress needles, and no sign of the creeping rot that usually defines the Florida interior. White picket fences, gleaming as if they had been painted that very hour, lined the street. Behind them sat small, charming bungalows in shades of seafoam green, pale yellow, and powder blue. "Caleb, look at the clock," June whispered. She reached out to touch the dashboard. The digital display, which had been ticking toward the midnight hour, was frozen. The numbers 12 o'clock blinked steadily, a rhythmic neon pulse in the dim cabin. The GPS screen was a flat, featureless gray, devoid of coordinates or maps. Even the ticking of the engine seemed to have been muffled by an invisible layer of insulation. It felt as if they were driving through a photograph, a moment captured in time and held still by some unseen force. Caleb didn't stop. The thrill of the discovery was a fever in his blood, overriding the cold dread that was clearly tightening its grip on his sister. He reached for his camera, checking the lens. "It's a time slip, June, or a collective hallucination. Do you see the street lamps?" Down the main stretch of the town, wrought iron street lamps began to flicker to life. They didn't cast the harsh, orange glow of modern sodium bulbs. They emitted a soft, warm, amber light that bathed the sidewalks in a nostalgic glow. In the distance, the sound of music began to drift through the open windows of the car. It was the faint, brassy swell of a big band orchestra, the kind of music that would have played on a vacuum tube radio in a simpler era. It was joyous, rhythmic, and utterly terrifying in its displacement. As they reached the first intersection, a movement caught June's eye. A small boy, perhaps 8 years old, was running down the sidewalk. He was dressed in high-waisted shorts and a striped polo shirt, his hair parted neatly to the side. He was chasing a wooden hoop with a stick, a toy from another century. He moved with a fluid, effortless grace, but as the SUV passed him, June noticed something that made her breath hitch in her throat. The boy's feet made no sound on the pavement. There was no slap-slap of sneakers, no rustle of fabric. He was a silent film moving through a technicolor world. Caleb stopped the car. "We need to turn around," June pleaded. Her hand was white-knuckled on the door handle. "We can't," Caleb replied, his voice a mix of awe and obsession. He pointed to the rearview mirror. June looked. Behind them, the white shell road did not stretch back into the swamp. It simply dissolved into a wall of impenetrable white mist. The forest they had just left was gone. There was no asphalt, no gas station, no old man with a whittling knife. There was only the town, and the fog that acted as its border. They were no longer in Florida. They were in Cypress Key, and the town had claimed the space where the rest of the world used to be. Caleb pulled the car to the curb in front of what looked like a town square. In the center stood a grand gazebo draped in bunting, surrounded by rose bushes that were unnaturally large and vibrant. People were beginning to emerge from the houses. Men in fedoras and light linen suits, women in floral tea dresses with perfectly coiffed hair. They moved toward the square with a synchronized purpose, their faces lit with wide, vacant smiles. They looked like neighbors heading to a block party, but their eyes remained fixed forward, never blinking. "Let's get out," Caleb said, his hand already on the door latch. "Are you crazy?" June hissed. "We don't know what these people are. We don't know where we are. That's why we're here, June. This is the story of a lifetime. Look at them, they look happy. They look peaceful. Maybe the legends were wrong. Maybe this isn't a haunting. Maybe it's a sanctuary." Caleb's curiosity was a blindfold. He saw the beauty of the pastel houses and the charm of the music, but he refused to see the way the shadows of the trees didn't quite line up with the light from the moon. He stepped out of the car, and the smell of orange blossoms nearly overwhelmed him. It was thick enough to taste, a sugary weight on his tongue. He held his camera up, the shutter clicking rapidly. He expected the people to turn, to be startled by the modern car or his strange clothes, but they ignored him entirely. They walked past the SUV as if it were a ghost, their conversations a low, melodic murmur that sounded like the humming of bees. June followed him out, more out of a fear of being left alone in the car than out of any desire to explore. She felt the ground beneath her feet. The crushed shells were cool, almost vibrating with a faint energy. She looked at a woman walking a small terrier. The dog didn't bark. It didn't sniff the air. It moved in perfect step with its owner, its glass-black eyes reflecting the amber street lamps. "Something is wrong with the light," June whispered, catching up to Caleb. "Look at the shadows, Caleb. They aren't moving when the people move. They're stuck." She was right. As the townsfolk walked, their shadows remained elongated and frozen on the grass, pointing toward the center of the square regardless of where the person stood. It was as if the people were merely projections cast upon a physical world, or perhaps the world itself was a stage and they were the actors who had forgotten how to leave. Caleb was too busy filming a group of teenagers sitting on a bench near a soda fountain shop. The shop's window was filled with glass jars of colorful candy and a sign that read, "Today's special, 5-cent floats." The teenagers were laughing, their mouths moving in silent mirth. Caleb stepped closer, hoping to catch a bit of their dialogue for his video. "Excuse me," Caleb called out. "Hi, I'm Caleb. We're a bit lost. Can you tell us where we are?" The teenagers didn't react. They continued their silent laughter, their eyes fixed on one another. Caleb reached out to tap one of the boys on the shoulder, but June grabbed his wrist, pulling him back. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a realization that hadn't yet reached her brother. "Don't touch them," she warned. "The old man said not to take anything that doesn't belong to us. That includes their attention, Caleb. We are intruders here." Caleb sighed, but he lowered his hand. "You're overreacting. It's just a strange local custom, or maybe they're just used to being left alone. Look at the sign over there. The Founders' Midnight Feast. It's starting in the town hall." He pointed toward a large, white-pillared building at the far end of the square. The doors were wide open, and a warm, golden light spilled out onto the steps. The music was louder there, a celebratory melody that seemed to pull at the senses, promising warmth, food, and belonging. Caleb began to walk toward it, drawn by the spectacle, his camera held high like a shield. June stood on the sidewalk, the sweet scent of the oranges now feeling like a physical pressure against her chest. She looked back at their SUV. It looked small and gray against the vibrant, impossible colors of Cypress Key. She knew that curiosity was a powerful engine, but she also knew that an engine without brakes was a dangerous thing. They were walking deeper into a trap lined with velvet and gold. "Wait for me," she called out, her voice sounding thin and brittle in the midnight air. As they stepped onto the marble stairs of the town hall, the music suddenly stopped. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the square. Every person, the boy with the hoop, the woman with the dog, the teenagers, stopped in their tracks. Slowly, with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, they all turned their heads toward the siblings. 100 pairs of eyes, reflecting the amber light, locked onto them. Caleb froze, his camera finally dipping. For the first time, he felt the weight of the caution he had ignored. Curiosity had led them to the door, but it would not tell them how to leave. "Welcome," a deep, booming voice echoed from inside the hall. "We've been waiting for some new stories to add to our collection." The shadows on the ground began to stretch, reaching toward Caleb and June like long, dark fingers. The suspense of the night was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a reality they had to survive. The silence that had gripped the town square was broken by a sudden, jarring burst of music. It was a triumphant trumpet fanfare, followed by the swinging, rhythmic pulse of a jazz band. The doors of the town hall didn't just stand open. They seemed to exhale a golden, honeyed light that pushed back the velvet darkness of the Florida night. Caleb, his camera still gripped tightly in his hands, felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the warmth. June, however, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. To her, the light didn't feel like a welcome, it felt like a lure. As they stepped across the threshold, the siblings were met with a sight of staggering opulence. The interior of the town hall was a masterpiece of mid-century architecture. Polished mahogany walls, floors of gleaming checkered marble, and a ceiling dominated by a crystal chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of stars. Long banquet tables stretched the length of the hall, draped in white linen so crisp it looked like carved stone. Every seat was filled with the residents of Cypress Key, their faces glowing in the amber light. At the head of the center table sat a man who radiated an almost blinding charisma. He wore a sharp, cream-colored suit with a silk carnation pinned to his lapel. His hair was silver, slicked back with military precision, and his smile was a perfect, unchanging curve of white teeth. This was the man who had spoken, the man who claimed to be the keeper of stories. "Welcome, travelers. Welcome to the midnight feast of Cypress Key," the man cried out, spreading his arms wide. "I am Mayor Sterling, and you have arrived just in time. In this town, we believe that no one should ever go hungry, and no story should ever go untold. Please find a seat. There is plenty for everyone." Caleb, enchanted by the visual splendor and the potential for the greatest viral video in history, began to move toward an empty pair of chairs. "June, look at this," he whispered, his voice thick with wonder. "The lighting, the costumes. If this is some kind of historical reenactment, it's the most expensive one on the planet. I need to get a close-up of the mayor." "Caleb, stop," June hissed, catching his sleeve. "Look at the people. Really look at them." June pointed toward a woman sitting nearby. She was dressed in a shimmering evening gown, her hands poised elegantly over a plate of what appeared to be a perfectly roasted turkey. But as June watched, the woman didn't actually cut the meat. She went through the motions, the lifting of the knife, the downward stroke, but the blade seemed to pass through the food without leaving a mark. The woman then lifted an empty fork to her lips, chewed with practiced grace, and smiled at the person across from her. It was a pantomime of a dinner, a ghostly ballet of etiquette. Despite June's warning, the mayor was already upon them, placing a heavy, warm hand on Caleb's shoulder. His touch felt strangely solid, yet there was a vibration to it, like the hum of a distant electrical transformer. "Come, young man. Your sister looks famished. The journey through the mist is a taxing one. Eat, drink, and tell us of the world you left behind. Is it still as loud and gray as it used to be?" The mayor led them to the head table, where 2 plates had been set. The food looked magnificent. There were mounds of mashed potatoes topped with golden wells of butter, green beans glistening with oil, and slices of ham glazed in honey and cloves. In the center of the table stood a massive bowl of Florida oranges, their skins so bright they seemed to vibrate against the white tablecloth. Caleb sat down, his hunger suddenly flaring up with an intensity that felt unnatural. He set his camera on the table, the lens pointed toward the mayor. It's beautiful," Caleb said, his eyes glazing over. "We don't have places like this anymore. Everything back home is glass and steel. This feels like a dream." "It is a dream that never has to end," Mayor Sterling replied, his blue eyes shimmering. "As long as you contribute to the town provides for you. Now please, taste the fruits of our labor." Caleb reached for a slice of the honey-glazed ham. He lifted it to his mouth, his nostrils filling with the scent of cloves. But the moment the meat touched his tongue, his expression shifted from delight to a mask of pure horror. The ham didn't taste like meat. It didn't taste like anything edible. It was dry, gritty, and cold. It felt like a mouthful of gray wood ash mixed with ancient dust. He coughed, the substance puffing out of his mouth in a small, gray cloud. He grabbed a glass of what looked like sparkling cider, desperate to wash the taste away, but the liquid was thick and stagnant, tasting of swamp water and old copper. He gagged, pushing the plate away so hard it rattled against the silverware. "Caleb!" June cried, reaching for him. She hadn't touched her food. She had been watching the mayor's reflection in the silver gravy boat. In the reflection, the mayor's face wasn't handsome or silver-haired. It was a hollowed-out skull draped in tattered gray skin, his eyes nothing more than flickering embers. The mayor's smile didn't waver, but the light in the room seemed to dim, the amber glow turning a sickly, bruised purple. "Is something wrong, Caleb? Is the bounty of the past not to your liking? Perhaps your palate has been spoiled by the artificial world outside." It's dirt," Caleb gasped, wiping his mouth with a napkin that felt like coarse sandpaper. "The food, it's all rot. June, we have to go. Now." Caleb reached for his camera, but as his fingers brushed the plastic casing, he jumped back. The camera, his most prized possession, was covered in a thick layer of cobwebs and green mold. The red recording light was no longer blinking. The lens was cracked, and the screen was filled with static that sounded like 1,000 whispering voices. In the span of a few minutes, his modern technology had aged decades, succumbing to the stagnant time of Cypress Key. The townsfolk, who had been silently eating their empty meals, suddenly stopped. They turned in unison, their forks and knives held mid-air. The music didn't stop this time. Instead, it began to warp. The joyful jazz slowed down, the notes stretching and sagging into a mournful, distorted dirge. "You cannot leave the table until the story is finished," Mayor Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its friendly veneer and becoming a low, echoing growl. "You came here seeking real stories, didn't you? You wanted to capture us, to put us in your little black box for the world to see. But that isn't how it works in Cypress Key. We are the ones who collect. We are the ones who keep." June stood up, pulling Caleb with her. "We don't want your stories. We just want to go home." The mayor leaned forward, the shadows under his cheekbones deepening until his face looked like a mask of shadows. "Home is a memory, and memories fade. Here, everything stays exactly as it is. No aging, no change, no death. Just the feast, every night, forever. Isn't that what you wanted? To find something that never changes." The moral weight of the moment pressed down on Caleb. He had been so focused on the outward appearance of the town, the gold of the lights and the glitter of the 1950s charm, that he had ignored the decay beneath. He had been greedy for the content, for the fame of the discovery, and in his greed, he had walked straight into a gilded cage. "Not everything that glitters is gold, Caleb," June whispered, repeating the lesson their grandfather had taught them years ago. "The most beautiful things can be the most hollow." The doors of the town hall began to creak shut, the heavy oak panels moving against the floor with a sound like grinding teeth. Outside, the white shell road was beginning to glow with a fierce, angry light, and the orange trees were dropping their fruit, which shattered like glass upon the ground. Caleb looked at his ruined camera and then at his sister. For the first time, the ambition was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, cold fear. He realized that the real stories of this town weren't about ghosts. They were about the people who got caught in the illusion and never found their way out. The side door, Caleb pointed toward a small service entrance near the bandstand. "Run, June." As they bolted toward the exit, the mayor didn't chase them. He simply sat back in his chair, picked up a hollow orange, and began to peel it. The skin fell away in gray, papery flakes. "Run all you like," he called out over the distorted music. "But remember the law of the lantern. In Cypress Key you only see what we allow you to see. And midnight is only the beginning." They burst through the side door and into the humid night. But the town square they had entered was no longer there. The houses were further away, and the street lamps were flickering out one by one, leaving them in a maze of shifting shadows and the overwhelming scent of rotting blossoms. The side door slammed shut behind them, muffling the distorted jazz and the hollow clatter of the feast. Caleb and June found themselves in a narrow alleyway that felt like it was shrinking. The walls, once pristine pastel wood, were now damp and covered in a thick, pulsating lichen that glowed with a faint, sickly green light. The air was no longer filled with the scent of orange blossoms. Instead, a heavy metallic smell, like old coins and wet earth, clung to their clothes. Caleb stumbled, his hand brushing against the lichen. It felt cold and slimy, sticking to his skin like cobwebs. He quickly wiped his hand on his jeans, but the green glow remained on his palm, a stubborn mark of the town's touch. He looked at his camera, which hung limply around his neck. The mold that had sprouted in the town hall was spreading, the plastic casing beginning to warp and crack as if it were being subjected to decades of heat and moisture in a matter of seconds. "We have to keep moving," June whispered, her voice tight. She was looking at the end of the alley, where the town square should have been. But the geography had shifted. Instead of the open plaza and the gazebo, there was a labyrinth of white picket fences that seemed to stretch upward like the bars of a cage. The street lamps were no longer amber. They were a piercing, cold blue, and they were flickering in a rhythmic pattern that felt like a countdown. As they emerged from the alley, a figure stepped out from behind one of the oversized rose bushes. It wasn't the mayor, but a tall, gaunt man carrying a long pole with a hooked end. He wore a tattered vest and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face into total shadow. In his other hand, he carried a heavy brass lantern. This was the lamplighter, a figure from the town's older legends, the one who decided which parts of Cypress Key remained visible and which were swallowed by the swamp. "The lights are fading, travelers," the lamplighter said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He didn't look at them. He was focused on the flickering blue bulb of the nearest street lamp. When the light dies, the memory dies with it, and anything caught in the shadow becomes part of the silt. Caleb, despite the rot on his camera, instinctively lifted it. He was obsessed. Even in the face of a supernatural threat, the habit of the content creator was hard to break. He wanted the world to see this man. He wanted the likes, the shares, and the validation that he had found something truly legendary. "Wait, just one shot. Tell me about the law of the lantern. Is this how the town disappears?" The lamplighter stopped. He turned his head slowly, and for a moment, the light from his brass lantern hit his face. He had no eyes, only smooth, pale skin where the sockets should have been. Yet he seemed to stare right through Caleb's lens. "You seek recognition for a world that does not exist here, boy. You want to take our image to feed your vanity. But in Cypress Key, we value the truth of the moment, not the shadow of the record." June stepped between Caleb and the blind man. "We don't want to take anything. We just want to know how to get back to the road." The old man at the gas station, he said to keep driving. "But there is no road anymore." The lamplighter chuckled, a sound like dry bones rattling in a jar. "The road is a matter of perspective. To the town, you are just more stories to be shelved. To the swamp, you are just salt and water. The law of the lantern is simple. You are only as real as the light that shines upon you." If you want to leave, you must find a light that belongs to you, not the town's amber glow, and certainly not the cold blue of the mayor's making. Suddenly, the blue street lamp above them hissed and went out. The darkness that rushed in wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight. June felt the ground beneath her feet turn soft and spongy, as if the solid pavement were reverting back into a peat bog. The white picket fence beside them dissolved into a tangle of thorny vines. "Caleb, the light! We're sinking!" June cried out. Caleb fumbled with his camera bag, searching for his high-powered LED flashlight. When he clicked it on, the beam was weak and yellow, struggling against the supernatural gloom. But it was enough. As soon as the artificial light hit the ground, the path solidified once more. The thorny vines retreated, and the picket fence flickered back into existence, though it looked weathered and gray. The lamplighter was gone, leaving only the fading echo of his laughter. The siblings realized they were being hunted by the darkness itself. The town wasn't just a place. It was a predator that fed on the reality of its guests. They began to run, Caleb holding the flashlight forward like a torch. But his mind was still fractured. He kept glancing at the ruined camera, trying to wipe the mold from the lens. "If I can just get it to turn on one more time," he muttered. "People need to see this. They need to know I was right." "Caleb, forget the camera," June shouted, her frustration finally boiling over. "The camera is what got us into this. You were so busy looking through a screen that you didn't see the warnings. You wanted the fame, but you didn't care about the truth of the danger. This isn't a story for your channel. This is our lives." Her words hit him harder than the humid air. He looked at the camera, the expensive piece of tech he had worked 3 jobs to buy. It was a symbol of his identity, of his desire to be someone important in the digital world. But here, in the shifting heart of Cypress Key, it was a heavy, useless anchor. It was a tool for recognition, but it had no authenticity in a place where time was a circle and shadows had a will of their own. They reached the edge of the residential district and looked back. The town hall was still glowing, a golden beacon in the center of the rot. The residents were now standing on their porches, their shadowless bodies perfectly still. They weren't watching with their eyes. They were watching with their presence, a collective weight of 1,000 souls who had chosen the eternal feast over the messy, difficult reality of the living world. The old man said, "Don't take anything," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at the camera again. He realized that by trying to capture the town, he was trying to take a piece of it with him. He was breaking the very rule that might have kept them safe. Caleb stopped at a small stone bridge that crossed a black, stagnant creek. He looked at the camera, then at June. With a deep breath, he unslung the strap from his neck and held the device over the water. "What are you doing?" June asked, though she already knew. "I'm choosing us," Caleb said. "I don't need a video to prove I was brave. I just need to be brave." He dropped the camera. It hit the black water with a dull thud and sank instantly, leaving only a few oily bubbles on the surface. As the device vanished, the yellow beam of his flashlight suddenly grew brighter, piercing through the mist with a newfound clarity. The cold, blue flickering of the street lamps seemed to recoil from the light. Authenticity had a power that recognition lacked. By letting go of his desire for fame, Caleb had reclaimed a piece of his own light. But the bridge they stood on began to tremble. From beneath the black water, hundreds of small, glowing lanterns began to rise. They weren't brass or iron. They were carved from the shells of ancient turtles and the bones of the swamps lost. They bobbed on the surface, casting an eerie, flickering light that showed the real story of Cypress Key, a town built on the foundations of those who couldn't let go of their past. "The bridge is moving," June warned. The structure wasn't a bridge at all. It was the spine of something ancient and submerged, a creature of the Everglades that served as the town's anchor. As it began to shift, the path forward became a narrow, precarious tightrope of bone and shell. The bridge didn't just tremble. It groaned with the sound of 1,000 years of submerged history. As Caleb and June scrambled across the shifting, bony spine of the structure, the black water of the creek bubbled and hissed. The small lanterns made of bone bobbed around them, their flickering flames casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. They reached the other side just as the bridge sank back into the silt with a heavy, wet thud, leaving them stranded in a part of Cypress Key they hadn't seen before. This was the Old Quarter. Here, the 1950s charm of the town square vanished, replaced by the heavy, oppressive architecture of Spanish colonial Florida. The houses were made of thick coquina stone, a mixture of crushed shells and coral that looked like it was bleeding salt. The air was colder here, and the scent of orange blossoms was replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ancient metal and the musty smell of a cellar that hadn't been opened in centuries. "We're moving backward in time," June whispered, her flashlight beam cutting through the thickening fog. "First the 50s, and now, this looks like it's from the 1700s. Caleb, still reeling from the loss of his camera, felt a different kind of pull. Despite the horror they had witnessed, the instinct of the explorer hadn't entirely died. It had only morphed into something more desperate. They passed a grand, stone building with heavy iron-studded doors. Above the entrance, carved into the lintel, were the words, "The Treasury of the Key." The doors were slightly ajar, and from within, a rhythmic metallic clicking sound echoed, a sound like coins being poured from one hand to another. "Caleb, don't," June warned, seeing the look in his eyes. "We need to find the edge of the town, not go inside more buildings." "Wait, June. Look," Caleb pointed. Through the crack in the door, a golden light spilled out. It wasn't the amber glow of the street lamps or the sickly purple of the town hall. This was a deep, rich, burnished gold. It was a light that promised security, power, and a way to start over. Caleb thought of the debt he'd accrued, the equipment he'd lost, and the empty bank account waiting for him in the real world. He pushed the door open before June could stop him. The interior was a vast vault, its walls lined with mahogany shelves. But instead of books or records, the shelves were overflowing with Spanish doubloons, heavy gold chains, and silver ingots. The floor was carpeted in a layer of gold coins so thick their footsteps were muffled. In the center of the room sat a woman in a tattered lace mantilla, her face veiled. She was slowly counting coins into a small wooden chest. "The price of the story is the weight you carry," the woman murmured, her voice sounding like the clinking of metal. She didn't look up. "Many come to Cypress Key for the mystery. They stay for the gold. They think it can buy their way out of the swamp. But gold has a memory, and it never forgets its owner." Caleb walked toward the nearest shelf, his hand shaking. He reached out and touched a heavy gold coin. It was warm, unnaturally warm, as if it were a living thing. The greed he had suppressed for his sister's sake flared up. He thought that if he could just take one handful, they would never have to worry about anything again. He wouldn't need a YouTube channel. He wouldn't need to chase legends. He could just be safe. "Caleb, remember the old man?" June cried, standing at the threshold. "He said don't take anything that doesn't belong to you. That gold is a trap. Just one, June. For the road. To pay for the gas. For the car. For everything." Caleb muttered, his voice sounding hollow and distant. He closed his fingers around a single, large doubloon. The moment the coin left the shelf, the atmosphere in the vault changed. The warm gold light turned a harsh, blinding white. The woman at the table stopped counting and slowly lifted her veil. Beneath the lace, there was no face, only a swirling vortex of black swamp water and white shells. The metallic clicking sound grew into a deafening roar, like 1,000 coins hitting the floor at once. The coins beneath Caleb's feet began to move. They weren't just metal. They were the teeth of the town. They swirled around his ankles, heavy and sharp, pulling him down. The weight of the single coin in his hand suddenly felt like a lead weight, dragging his arm toward the floor. He tried to drop it, but the coin was stuck to his palm, the gold beginning to fuse with his skin in a slow, agonizing heat. It's not wealth, Caleb. It's the weight of the souls who couldn't let go. June screamed. She ran into the room, grabbing Caleb's other arm and pulling with all her might. As she touched him, June saw a flash of the real stories the town held. She saw the faces of the people in the town square, the boy with the hoop, the mayor, the woman with the terrier. They hadn't been lured by magic. They had been lured by their own desires. The boy wanted to stay young forever. The woman wanted to keep her pet. The mayor wanted power. And now, they were all bound to the silt, their identities replaced by the perfect versions of their greed. The gold coin on Caleb's hand began to glow with a dark, pulsing light. He groaned, the weight of it forcing him to his knees. I can't let go, June. It's too heavy. Yes, you can, June shouted. It's just metal, Caleb. It's not your life. Look at me. The gold isn't real, but I am. Our family is real. The moral lesson of their father's stories echoed in Caleb's mind. Greed is a heavy burden to carry, and it will sink the strongest ship. He looked at his sister, her face etched with terror and love. He realized that the gold was just another illusion of the town, a more sophisticated version of the ash-tasting feast. He closed his eyes and visualized the mud, the swamp, and the rotting wood of the real Florida. He chose the struggle of the living over the ease of the dead. With a scream of effort, Caleb didn't just try to drop the coin. He rejected the idea of it. He tore his hand away, leaving a thin layer of skin behind on the metal. The coin hit the floor with a sound like a thunderclap, and the swirling vortex of gold suddenly collapsed. The vault vanished, replaced by a damp, crumbling stone cellar filled with nothing but rusted iron and stagnant water. The woman in the lace mantilla was gone. The treasury was just a ruin. Caleb slumped against a damp wall, his hand bleeding and his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his palm. It was scarred, a permanent reminder of the moment he almost traded his soul for a lie. He felt a profound sense of shame, but beneath it, a new kind of clarity. He had lost his camera to vanity and almost lost his life to greed. "We have to get out of the old quarter," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. "The town, it knows our weaknesses now. It's going to use them against us." As they stumbled back out into the street, the mist was no longer white. It was turning a deep, bruised charcoal color. The Spanish colonial buildings were beginning to lean inward, their stone walls sweating a thick, black oil. From the shadows of the doorways, the true forms of the residents began to emerge. They were no longer the pristine figures of the 1950s or the dignified Spanish lords. They were tattered, gray husks, their bodies made of moss and bone, their eyes glowing with the same cold, blue light as the street lamps. The real stories of Cypress Key were finally showing their faces, and they were hungry for company. The siblings realized that the town was no longer trying to charm them into staying. It was preparing to hunt them down. "The sun," June said, looking at the sky. "It's been midnight for hours. When does the sun come up?" "In Cypress Key," a voice echoed from the shadows. "The sun only rises for those who have nothing left to lose. But you You still have each other. The transition was as relentless as the tide. In the real Florida, the transition from life to death is a slow, humid crawl of decay. Vines choking out the sunlight, insects returning the fallen to the earth. But in Cypress Key, the rot was a violent, accelerated process. As Caleb and June fled the stone ruins of the treasury, the town began to peel. The pristine pastel paint on the houses bubbled and sloughed off like dead skin, revealing damp, gray wood underneath that pulsed with the rhythm of a failing heart. The sweet, cloying scent of orange blossoms that had dominated the air was gone, replaced by the fetid, heavy odor of a swamp that had been stagnant for centuries. The vibrant emerald lawns turned into patches of black, oily mud, and the rose bushes, once so lush and inviting, withered in seconds, their thorns growing long and jagged, like the teeth of a predator. The beauty was an illusion that could no longer be maintained, and the real story of the town was finally being told in the language of decay. "Caleb, don't look back," June whispered, though she couldn't help herself. Behind them, the residents they had seen in the town square were changing. The woman with the terrier was no longer an elegant lady in a floral dress. She was a translucent, skeletal figure draped in tattered gray moss. The dog she held was a hollowed-out husk, its glass eyes now glowing with a cold, flickering blue light. They weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They were echoes of people who had refused to die, and because they refused the natural end of their lives, they had become something far worse than dead. They had become eternal rot. They stumbled into a botanical garden that sat between the old quarter and the residential district. In the moonlight, the garden had looked like a paradise, but now it was a graveyard of petrified wood and grasping vines. The siblings found themselves surrounded by memorial trees, ancient oaks where the residents of Cypress Key had hung their most precious belongings to preserve them forever. There were lockets, baby shoes, wedding rings, and faded photographs, all encased in a strange, amber-like sap that dripped from the branches. "This is how they do it," Caleb said, his voice trembling as he looked at a photograph encased in the sap. It showed a young couple laughing on a porch. "They pin their memories to the town. They think if they can keep the moment from changing, they can live forever. But look at them, June. They're not living. They're just stuck." Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a weeping willow that was shedding its leaves like gray tears. It was the young boy with the hoop. Up close, he was a terrifying sight. His striped shirt was stained with swamp water, and his face was a mask of pale, waxy skin. He held his wooden hoop, but it was no longer a toy. It was a circle of jagged bone. "Do you want to play?" the boy asked. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It vibrated in the air around them, a hollow, buzzing sound like 1,000 cicadas. "If you stay in the garden, you never have to grow old. You never have to lose anything. You just have to give the tree one memory. Just one." The boy reached out toward June, his fingers long and spindly. Caleb stepped in front of her, the scar on his hand from the gold coin beginning to throb. He realized that the boy wasn't being malicious. He was simply lonely. He was a victim of a parent's refusal to let him go. A soul trapped in a moment of perfect childhood that had long since turned into a nightmare of stagnation. "We can't stay, kid," Caleb said softly, his fear giving way to a profound sense of pity. "Life isn't supposed to stay the same. It's supposed to end. That's what makes it beautiful. You're supposed to be a memory, not a monument." The boy's expression didn't change, but a single tear of black, oily sap rolled down his cheek. As it hit the ground, the garden began to tremble. The memorial trees started to moan, the sound of the wind through their branches turning into a chorus of 1,000 voices all crying out for a rest that wouldn't come. The residents were closing in, their mossy forms drifting through the rotting vines like smoke. "The natural cycle," June whispered, remembering their mother's garden back home. "Everything that blooms must fade to nourish what comes next. By stopping the clock, they've poisoned the soil." The moral weight of the town's curse was finally clear. The people of Cypress Key hadn't been taken by a monster. They had been taken by their own fear of loss. They had chosen a beautiful lie over a difficult truth, and the rot was the price of their cowardice. To respect life, one must also respect death. By trying to cheat the end, they had forfeited the journey. "Run!" Caleb shouted as the boys' bone hoop shattered into dust. They dashed through the garden, the thorns tearing at their clothes. Behind them, the boy vanished into the mist, his hollow voice joining the chorus of the trees. The siblings realized that the town was no longer a place of charm or wealth. It was a sinking ship of spirits, and they were the only things left that still had the warmth of life. As they reached the far edge of the garden, they saw a gate made of tangled iron and cypress roots. It was the Midnight Gate, the final boundary between the vanishing town and the world that continued to turn. But the gate was guarded by something they hadn't expected. A mirror. A massive, ornate mirror stood in the center of the path, its glass perfectly clear despite the surrounding decay. To pass the gate, they had to look into it. But the mirror didn't show their faces. It showed their potential futures, the lives they would lead if they escaped, the gray hairs they would grow, the mistakes they would make, and the eventual, inevitable end of their stories. "It's showing us our deaths," Caleb whispered, his breath hitching. "No," June replied, her hand finding his. "It's showing us our lives. It's showing us that we get to change. That's the gift they threw away." The mirror began to crack, the sound like a gunshot in the silent, rotting woods. The residents were only feet away now, their cold, blue light reflecting in the shattering glass. The siblings had to make a choice. Embrace the messy, fading reality of the future, or become another set of shadows in the eternal town. Caleb looked at his scarred hand, then at the shattered remains of his camera back in the creek, and finally at the gate. He wasn't the same man who had driven into the forest looking for a viral video. He was a man who had seen the rot beneath the bloom and understood the value of the sunset. "We're going home, June," he said firmly. As they stepped toward the mirror, the ground beneath them began to dissolve into the white shell road once more. But this time, the road was cracked and broken, leading toward a horizon that was beginning to glow with a faint, bruised purple light. The midnight hour was nearing its end, and the town was preparing for its daily disappearance. The mirror did not just crack. It disintegrated into a million diamond-sharp shards that hovered in the stagnant air. Each fragment reflected a different version of the world. Some showed the lush, deceptive beauty of Cypress Key at midnight, while others showed the gray, skeletal rot that lay beneath. As Caleb and June stepped through the remains of the glass, the very geometry of the town began to betray them. The straight, white shell road began to curve and loop back on itself like a dying serpent. The houses didn't stay still. They shifted and folded into the mist, chimneys swapping places with porches, windows turning into doors that led only into the black, sucking mud of the swamp. "It's a labyrinth," Caleb gasped, his boots sinking into a patch of ground that had been solid stone seconds before. "The town is trying to keep us from reaching the boundary. It's closing its walls." The midnight gate was visible in the distance, a massive archway of petrified cypress wood that marked the exit from this pocket of impossible time. But every time they ran toward it, a new street would rise up to block them, or a row of identical, crumbling bungalows would stretch out for what felt like miles, trapping them in a repetitive nightmare of peeling paint and shuttered windows. The air was vibrating now, a low-frequency hum that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. It was the sound of the town's reality breaking down as the clock moved toward the first light of a dawn that Cypress Key could not survive. Suddenly, the path ahead was blocked by a figure that had regained its human mask, though the edges were fraying. Mayor Sterling stood in the center of the road, leaning casually against a street lamp that was sputtering with a dying orange flame. He no longer looked like a leader. He looked like a prisoner who had grown fond of his cell. "You're making a mistake," Sterling said, his voice smooth despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Outside this gate, there is only noise, aging, and the slow, inevitable march toward a grave. Here you are eternal. You are preserved. Why would you trade a masterpiece for a smudge of charcoal?" "Because the smudge is real," June shouted, her voice echoing off the shifting houses. "Your masterpiece is a graveyard where the residents have forgotten their own names. We'd rather grow old and be forgotten than stay here and never have been at all." The mayor's smile thinned until it was a razor edge. "Noble, but the gate is a heavy thing to move. It doesn't open for the empty-handed. To leave Cypress Key, you must pay the toll. You must leave behind the thing that ties you most strongly to the world you seek to return to." Caleb reached into his pockets. He had nothing. His camera was at the bottom of the creek. His pride had been stripped away in the treasury. He looked at his sister, and a cold dread settled in his stomach. Was the town asking for one of them to stay so the other could go? Was that the real story of the few who had escaped, that they had left a piece of their soul behind in the form of a loved one? "No," June whispered, as if reading his mind. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver compass. It was an heirloom from their grandfather, the man who had taught them how to read the stars and find their way home when they were children. It was the only thing she had left that felt like home. It was the anchor that had kept her grounded while Caleb chased ghosts. "The compass," Sterling murmured, his eyes fixed on the spinning needle. "A symbol of direction, a symbol of the future. Give it to the town and the gate will open. Keep it, and you will wander these streets until your bones turn to moss." Caleb stepped forward, trying to take it from her. "June, no. That's the only thing you have left of Grandpa. I'll stay. I'm the one who brought us here. I'm the one who ignored the warnings." "That's not how bravery works, Caleb," June said, her eyes filling with tears but her hand remaining steady. "Bravery isn't just fighting the monster. It's knowing what you have to let go of to move forward. Grandpa wouldn't want us to stay in a museum of the past. He'd want us to find our own way, even if we have to do it without his map." She didn't hand the compass to the mayor. She walked past him, toward the great petrified archway of the midnight gate. The mayor didn't move to stop her, but the ground began to heave, and the air grew so thick with the scent of rot that Caleb had to cover his mouth to keep from retching. The residents, the mossy, skeletal husks, were lining the road now, their blue eyes watching with a silent, desperate hunger. They weren't waiting for a sacrifice. They were waiting for a reason to hope, or a reason to finally give up. At the foot of the gate there was a small stone pedestal. It was worn smooth by the touches of countless others who had stood where they were standing. With a trembling hand, June placed the silver compass on the stone. The moment the metal touched the rock, a shockwave of white light erupted from the gate. It wasn't the warm, amber light of the town, but the harsh, cold, beautiful light of truth. The silver compass didn't just sit there. It began to melt, the metal flowing into the cracks of the pedestal like liquid starlight. The moral lesson of their journey resonated through the air. To find your way into the future, you must sometimes leave the comforts of the past behind. The compass was a tool for the road they had already traveled, but they were entering a new chapter where they would have to trust their own hearts. The petrified wood of the gate began to groan and split. The heavy vines that had kept it shut for a century withered and fell away. Through the opening, they could see the dark, messy, beautiful reality of the Florida swamp. Not the perfect version, but the real one, with its mosquitoes, its mud, and its unpredictable shadows. "Go!" Caleb yelled, grabbing June's hand. They ran through the archway, the ground behind them dissolving into a void. The mayor's voice followed them, a fading whisper in the wind. "The world will forget you eventually, but Cypress Key would have kept you forever." As they crossed the threshold, the white shell road vanished. They tumbled forward, landing hard on damp, black earth. The air was suddenly hot and heavy again, smelling of sulfur and wet leaves. The silence of the town was replaced by the chaotic, wonderful noise of a real forest. The croak of a bullfrog, the rustle of a palmetto frond, the distant hum of a highway. They scrambled to their feet and looked back. The gate was gone. The white shell road was gone. Behind them stood only a wall of ancient cypress trees, their knees submerged in the dark water of the Everglades. The mist was thinning, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the sky began to change. The oppressive midnight black was bleeding into a deep, bruised violet, and then a thin ribbon of gold appeared on the horizon. "We made it!" June breathed, her chest heaving. She looked at her empty hand, where the compass had been. She felt a pang of loss, but also a lightness she hadn't felt since they crossed the border. "We're not safe yet," Caleb said, looking at the forest around them. "We're miles from the car, and the sun is coming up. We need to find the road." But as they turned to find their bearings, Caleb noticed something. The scar on his hand, the one from the gold coin, wasn't just a scar. It was glowing with a faint, pulse-like light that matched the rhythm of his heart. And in the mud at their feet, there was a single white seashell, perfectly preserved, pointing toward the north. The town was gone, but it hadn't let them go entirely. They had escaped the vanishing town, but the real story was only just beginning to reveal its consequences. The first rays of the Florida sun were not golden. They were a sharp, piercing white that cut through the thinning mist like a blade. For Caleb and June, the light was both a savior and a herald of a cold, new reality. They stood on the edge of the Everglades, their clothes tattered, their skin caked in the black, sulfuric muck of the swamp. Behind them, there was no sign of a town, no white shell road, and no iron-studded gate. There was only the endless, rhythmic cree-cree of the morning cicadas and the distant, lonely cry of a red-shouldered hawk. Caleb looked down at his hand. The scar where the gold coin had fused to his skin was no longer glowing, but it had turned into a permanent, silver-colored mark in the shape of a Spanish doubloon. It was a brand, a physical receipt for a debt he had almost paid with his soul. Beside him, June stared at the empty space where she had last seen the midnight gate. Her hands were tucked into her pockets, her fingers brushing against the absence of her grandfather's compass. "We need to find the car," Caleb said, his voice sounding like gravel. It was the first time he had spoken since they crossed the threshold, and the sound of a human voice in the vast, wild silence felt strangely fragile. They began to trek through the sawgrass, their movements slow and heavy. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape was gone, replaced by an exhaustion that reached deep into their bones. Every step away from the site of the vanishing town felt like dragging a weight. After an hour of walking, they stumbled upon the narrow asphalt road where they had first seen the mist. Parked on the shoulder was Caleb's SUV. To anyone else, it would have looked like a normal car, but as they approached, June gasped. The vehicle, which had been clean and functional only hours before, was covered in a thick layer of fine, gray dust. The tires were slightly deflated, and a vine of wild morning glory had already begun to wind itself around the front bumper. Inside, the digital clock was no longer frozen at midnight. It was blinking 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock, a relentless reset. Caleb fumbled for his keys. When the engine finally turned over, it coughed and sputtered, releasing a cloud of dark smoke that smelled of stagnant water. They drove in silence, the air conditioner struggling to push back the encroaching heat of a Florida summer morning. As they passed the site where the gas station had been, Caleb slowed the car to a crawl. The building was there, but it was not the flickering, lived-in outpost they had visited. It was a hollowed-out ruin. The roof had long ago collapsed under the weight of the ferns, and the rusted pump was now nothing more than a jagged piece of iron sticking out of the weeds. On the porch, where the old man had sat whittling his crane, there was only a pile of rotting timber. Caleb stepped out of the car, drawn by a sudden impulse. He walked onto the crumbling porch, his boots crunching on glass. There, sitting atop a moss-covered railing, was a small object. It was a wooden crane perfectly carved, but the wood was dark and petrified, as if it had been sitting in the swamp for 50 years. He picked it up. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of the same orange blossoms that had lined the streets of Cypress Key. "He was never there, June," Caleb whispered, returning to the car and handing the carving to his sister. The old man, the warning, he was just the last piece of the town that hadn't quite vanished yet. As they drove further away, reaching the main highway where the world felt loud and fast once more, the surreal terror of the night began to scab over. They saw billboards for theme parks, trucks hauling citrus, and families in minivans heading toward the coast. The real stories of the world were mundane, filled with traffic and schedules. But for Caleb and June, the world would never look the same. Caleb looked at the empty space on his dashboard where his camera used to sit. He had gone into the woods looking for a way to make himself famous, a way to capture a legend and own it. He had returned with nothing but a scar and a memory. But as he watched the sunrise reflect in the rearview mirror, he realized that he had gained something far more valuable than a viral video. He had gained the weight of his own life. "I'm not going to post about it," Caleb said, his eyes fixed on the road. "No blogs, no stories, no investigations. If people go looking for Cypress Key because of us, they might find it. And not everyone has a sister like you to pull them back." June nodded, clutching the wooden crane. "The past is a beautiful place to visit, Caleb, but it's a terrible place to live. Grandpa's compass is gone, but I think I finally know which way we're supposed to go." The moral lesson of Cypress Key stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Cherish the present, for the past cannot be recaptured, and the future is a gift that must be earned every day. They learned to appreciate the wrinkles on their faces, the fading of the seasons, and the simple, messy reality of a world that moves forward. They understood that the things we try to keep forever are the things that eventually own us. Years later, Caleb would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, his hand throbbing with a faint, silver light. He would walk to the window and look toward the dark silhouette of the Florida interior. He knew that somewhere out there, when the clock struck 12 and the mist rolled in, a white shell road was appearing. He knew that Mayor Sterling was still peeling his ash-tasting oranges, and the boy was still chasing his bone hoop in a garden that never died. But Caleb would just turn back to his bed, listen to the steady breathing of his family, and smile. He didn't need to see the town anymore. He had discovered the most important real story of all, that the most haunted places aren't filled with ghosts, but with people who forgot how to say goodbye. Cypress Key remains a legend, whispered by truckers and hikers who find themselves on the wrong road after midnight. They say if you smell orange blossoms when there are no groves in sight, you should keep your eyes on the road and your heart in the present. Because some towns don't just disappear, They wait for the curious to give them a reason to exist.